Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vogt, the host and the senior publishing director at Word on Fire. Do we have a right to choose how and when we die? Should we be worried about the rapid rise of euthanasia in the Western world, including in the United States? That's what we'll be discussing today with Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, always good to be with you.
Hey, Brandon. Good to be with you. I was out and about a little bit this morning in Rochester. I'm not sure when this show will go on, but as we're recording, it was very beautiful, sunny, bright blue sky, lots of beautiful snow and the trees on the ground, and it was 2 degrees.
Sunny and 2 degrees.
Yeah, sunny and 2 is the forecast for today.
Well, you recently visited another cold climate, which is your home in Chicago.
Yeah.
You went back there for, I think, Thanksgiving. And
Yeah.
while you were there, you had some time in the Word on Fire Chicago office. How did that go?
Yeah, it was lovely. I was there to baptize my grandniece, so my brother's second grandchild. I baptized her when I was home. And while I was there, I went to the Word on Fire office, which is wonderful. They had to expand. The old one got too small. So it's about 10 minutes from the airport. So it was very easy to get to. And it was terrific. I took the whole gang out for lunch and didn't see quite everybody because it was around Thanksgiving time, so some had gone, home. But it was a great visit, beautiful office, and to see these mostly young people with great enthusiasm for the mission. Loved it.
I know there's lots of good stuff going on in your new diocese of Winona, Rochester. Yeah. We're recording this in mid-December, just after a couple of big liturgical celebrations. One is the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and the other one is Simbang Gabi. Tell us about those. How'd those go?
Oh, they both were great. So, of course, Guadalupe I've known very well from my time in Chicago and, of course, in L.A. It's the great celebration for the Hispanic community. And there's a church called St. Francis of Assisi here in Rochester with a large Hispanic population. And it reminded me of California. The church was jammed. It was my first opportunity since I've been here to celebrate Mass in Spanish, which I loved, and to preach in Spanish. And then afterwards, we had the mariachi band. They played during the liturgy too, but the mariachi, and then the Aztec dancers come out. That's always a fixture of Guadalupe, and they usually come out in the Aztec garb, and then they come up and they do reverence to the Blessed Mother, and then they do the Aztec dancing with this marvelous drumming, this really insistent drumming. So it was a lot of fun. I love that. And then Simbang Gabi is the great Christmas celebration for the Filipino community. And again, Chicago and LA has the biggest Simbang Gabi celebration I've ever seen. I think they got like 4,000 people at the cathedral for that. It's the big Christmas celebration for the Filipinos. And so we had that here in Rochester at the Co-Cathedral where I was installed. So that was a joy too. Then we had, of course, big feasts after each one, that you eat. If I ate everything put in front of me as bishop of this diocese, I'd be about 400 pounds, So I sampled a few little things at the Simbang Gabi dinner.
Well, let's move from feasting to one of the worrisome trends in our culture today, namely euthanasia. Euthanasia has been in the news a lot lately, especially with our neighbors in the north, Canada. There's been some reports coming out that last year, over 10,000 Canadians ended their lives via euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. And those numbers are sure to go up because what's alarming is the restrictions around euthanasia continue to loosen. So initially, euthanasia was only prescribed for people suffering intense pain, terminal illness, irreversible coma. But now it's been loosened to apply to anybody for any mental health reasons, a big umbrella under which almost anything can fall. But before getting to euthanasia in particular, I want to ask you about end-of-life dignity, because that's the general foundation underneath this whole discussion. For years, the Catholic Church's pro-life commitment has demanded that life be respected from the moment of conception until natural death. Natural death. I've always found that interesting. Why natural death? Why not just death in general?
Well, it's under the rubric, Brandon, of our lives are not about us and our lives don't belong to us. It's a basic biblical intuition which informed at least Western culture for, millennia, and is now, in light of our really maniacal stress on autonomy, being threatened. But the idea is that life is not mine. I mean, I agree with Heidegger here, where he talks about that we were thrown into being. It just means that I'm suddenly given this gift. I had nothing to do with it. I didn't earn it or deserve it. I was given this gift of life. And that life doesn't belong to me. It's God's prerogative when life begins, when life ends. And I can't take upon myself the responsibility or the prerogative of ending life. I have to accept it as a gift, and with all of its ups and downs. Not every moment of life is blissful. Life is full of sufferings and negativity, but all of it is seen under the rubric of God's providence, and so it's just not in my uh, morally legitimate range to be ending life. The basic, if I can put it now in less theological terms and more philosophical terms, is a direct attack upon innocent life is always wrong. We can't find a justification. Under certain circumstances, I guess you could take an innocent life. No, because such a move is, we say, intrinsice malum. It's intrinsically evil. It's by its very nature evil. So, the person is suffering enormously. Yeah, I know, but still, taking an innocent life is intrinsice malum. Well, that baby's going to pose a huge threat to a family, a huge burden financially and emotionally. Yeah, maybe, but you can't end an innocent life. So I say those two things. One, a theological, my life doesn't belong to me. And then secondly, the direct attack on innocent life is intrinsically evil and can never be justified. Now, those two things are being lost sight of today in light of our secularization and in light of our relativization of all moral values. Given those two overarching perspectives, that's why things like euthanasia are reasserting themselves.
When we speak about euthanasia, we're referring to killing someone to relieve them from suffering or the prospect of suffering down the line. Again, usually a terminal disease, an irreversible coma, something like that. This is related to physician-assisted suicide, which is also on the rise. This is where someone kills themselves with the help of medical staff. Usually a doctor will give them some pills that when they take these pills, they overdose and die. Both of these practices are euphemistically referred to as mercy killing. You may have heard that phrase before. The suggestion is just as we would put to sleep a sick or suffering animal, a dog, a horse, another animal who's on the brink of death so that the animal can avoid needless suffering and pain, so we should do the same thing to humans. What would you say to this sort of reasoning? Why is it fine to put animals down but not humans?
Because there's a qualitative difference between animal life and human life. There's a certain continuity. I mean, we are animals. We have animal bodies and so on, but we're not respecting the distinctiveness of human life, which is related to the soul, and the soul, which is our link to God and to immortality. Human life is, in this very unique sense, a gift from God. And there's a qualitative difference between that form of life and animal life. And not to see that is to lose sight of this properly religious dimension to our humanity. Is there a dimension of our cognition, a dimension of our volition, which is not reducible simply to biological facts? Yeah, there's something that stretches beyond the mere biological level of life and rises to a properly intellectual and spiritual level. To recognize that is essential to recognizing what makes human beings distinctive. And that's why, as you say correctly, euthanasia, euthanatos, has the sense of a happy death, or an easeful death. Well, we can pray for happy death, which indeed we do, but it's not our prerogative. It's not our prerogative to compel that or to will it. But we accept it, we pray for it, and leave it in the hands of God.
Fulton Sheen wrote books and had a TV series that bore the slogan, "Life is worth living."
Yeah.
Life is worth living. Yet it seems to me that with the movement toward euthanasia, there's an emphasis on exactly the opposite slogan, namely that some lives are not worth living, particularly people who are sick, disabled, in pain. How would you respond to the premise that there may come a point at a person's life where their life no longer becomes worth living, that it's not worth going on?
That's God's business, not their business. It's not us to make that decision, not our prerogative. See, and Brandon, another thing we've lost sight of in our culture is that suffering itself might be ingredient in the divine plan. In fact, it is. That's central to Christianity. When we put an image of this man suffering unto death, right before our eyes, so that suffering can have a salvific quality. Think here of John Paul II's great writings about that, of the salvific power of suffering. If it's accepted from God as a means of perhaps bringing healing to others, it's accepted as a suffering on behalf of someone else. It's a purging of something in me that needs purging. There's a lot of different perspectives on what suffering means. But if you take God out of the picture and it's simply a matter of my animal life, when you say, okay, well, I'm in this terrible pain, there's no point to that, let's just end it. Again, it might be appropriate to talk about a dog that way, but you shouldn't talk about a human being that way, especially if you have the divine perspective on life. Life with all of its ups and downs, with its light and darkness, it's all, in some sense, a gift from God. So what's God doing with our suffering? What happens if we place our suffering in the hands of God? We offer it to God as a kind of gift. The conviction of the great Christian tradition is that that has a salvific impact for oneself and for others. That mysterious dynamic, call it, that I don't know exactly how to explain it precisely, but that my suffering, patiently borne and offered to God, might alleviate the suffering of somebody else. And it's because of the interconnected quality of the elements of the mystical body. If I say, Lord, accept my suffering as a way of relieving the suffering of somebody else. Again, don't ask me to explain in detail how that happens. I can't. But it's a deep conviction of ours, grounded in the cross of Jesus, whereby his suffering alleviates our suffering, physically and spiritually. So regaining this spiritual perspective helps us to avoid this reduction of human life simply to the animal level, which then opens the door toward euthanasia.
This is where I think the beautiful witness of people who suffer well is important in battling against this rise in euthanasia. You highlighted the writings of John Paul II, but I think of his life as a witness to the value of heroic suffering, especially those last, 5-10 years of his life.
Oh, absolutely. And he has that great virtue of not just writing about something, but then showing us by his life. I mean, he understood that. Cardinal Harvey is someone that I've come to know, and Cardinal Harvey, who's still based in Rome, but he was John Paul II's head of the papal household. So he was in charge of all of his liturgical activities and in his household. He knew him very well. And he often speaks very movingly of that, of what that meant in John Paul's own life and the effect it had on people around him. So, that's no small thing.
I want to talk about the expansion of the application of both euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. I've mentioned a couple times how for years it was kind of hovering in the background with a very limited application. Maybe a few dozen people were euthanized who were just days or weeks away on the verge of death and intense suffering. Now the number of people who qualify or who seek euthanasia or assisted suicide is rapidly expanding. I'm going to give you a few statistics here. A study by the Dutch government, Netherlands, tracked 8,100 patients who died after being intentionally overdosed on pain medication that was given to them specifically to end their lives rather than relieve their pain. And what the study found was that 61% of those 8,000 people were given the overdose without their consent. So in other words, 61% of the time they were killed. Innocent people were killed, which is, again, what we call murder, involuntary euthanasia, if you will. Now, you might think that's just in Europe. That's not happening here. Well, au contraire. In the state of Oregon, their State Health Services Commission recently voted 10-1 to include physician-assisted suicide as a form of comfort care for all low-income, terminally ill patients that are covered by the state's Medicaid program. So in other words, if you're a poor person in Oregon with a terminal disease, the state of Oregon will not cover your treatments, but they will cover physician-assisted suicide for you. many other
Well, big
states
of them,
have
huh?
adopted the same positions.
Sure, but just to get
But
people out of the way, there's something so brutal about that, isn't there? Get certain troublesome people out of the way that we don't want to have to bother with anymore.
But I think, and this is the one I want to hear your thoughts on the most, is now the expansion beyond just qualifying people for financial, economic reasons, but now this broader umbrella of
Yeah.
mental health concerns, that euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide are solutions to anybody with mental health issues. What do you make of that?
Well, that's the slippery slope problem. You saw it with the abortion issue too. Go back to an old movie like The Cardinal, which was made like in the early 1960s, and they present this scene. The cardinal's sister is pregnant, and there's this awful moment, and this is set earlier, like back in the 30s, or 20s, when it was the life of the baby or life of the mother. This kind of desperate choice had to be made. Well, I mean, even those who were advocating for abortion in those days, maybe that very extreme case was seen as, a justification. What's happened, though, is that once you open that door, now, like in our country, sure, if a child is going to pose any kind of emotional distress to the mother, well, that's sufficient reason for aborting the child. So we went very quickly down a slippery slope. Once you negate the category of the intrinsically evil. So it's not intrinsically evil, abortion. I mean, you can do it under certain circumstances. Well, watch how those circumstances go from the most dire to the most trivial. Well, the same has happened now with the euthanasia debate. So as you say, someone at the last moments of life in excruciating pain, they're going to live for just another day. And, so can't we, to go from that case to, well, I'm having kind of a bad week. I'm feeling kind of down. And so, sure, let's go ahead with this suicide. That's the danger. But the real problem is the suspension of the category of the intrinsically evil. Brandon, I'll do a little autobiography. Years ago when I was going through seminary, it was all the rage to teach what's called proportionalism. That's the view that, nothing is intrinsically really good or evil. It's just a matter of circumstances and consequences. And so you do a particular act and you weigh the good and evil that comes from it. And, based on that, you make a calculation. Well, I know that strikes people as kind of a reasonable point of view, but, once you start pressing on that, you see the extraordinary danger of it. Because every slope becomes slippery at that point. We say, well, yeah, if I can find a, justifying consequence, why not? And so, yeah, I'm just having a really bad time. I'm very depressed. And so, sure, let me kill myself. Well, why not? If it's simply a matter of you're going to weigh good and evil, and that all depends on your psychology and your personality. So the recovery of the category of intrinsically evil. Now, I was studying that stuff back in the early 80s. What happened 10 years later? John Paul II, right, writes his great encyclical on the moral life, the central theme of which was no to proportionalism and to this moral relativism and the reaffirmation of the category of the intrinsically evil, veritatis splendor, right? Which I would agree with many who say it was the finest encyclical that John Paul wrote. And that issue, that's very much alive here. Once that category is gone, the door is wide open.
We've seen this with a lot of different social issues where the door opens a little bit toward tolerance, and then it slides down the slope to acceptance, and then
celebration.
It goes to celebration.
Yep.
Yeah, that's the inevitable end. And I was thinking about that in light of this commercial. I think both of us saw it. Maybe I'll include a link to it if I can find the link again. But it's from Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what group is sponsoring it, but it's a commercial effectively celebrating euthanasia, and it has beautiful music and uplifting vistas and a person saying my life is horrible, but now I'm happy because I'm going to end it in this beautiful, inspiring way. And I thought when I saw that about a recent statement I had seen put out by the World Health Organization on suicide, relatedly, they said that positive media coverage of suicide can lead to imitative suicidal behaviors. And so they caution against anything portraying suicide as glamorous or hopeful or beautiful. I'm quoting them here. They say, avoid language which sensationalizes or normalizes suicide or presents it as a solution to problems. Yet again, this is exactly how euthanasia is presented today. What does it say to the young teenager sunk in depression if suicide is the best solution for a suffering person at the end of their life? Why not a teenager in the early parts of their life?
Sure, and that's the door that's been open in our culture now for a while of complete self-determination, self-creation of value. I determine the meaning of my life in every sense, so why not the meaning of my own death? And see, part of it, Brandon, is that I would say we, the churches, have gotten so bad at articulating our view of things, our view of life. We've allowed the culture to position us in so many ways. And that's a good example of it, is, yeah, look how beautiful this is, and look how this affirms who you are. The churches have got to stand athwart this business. And I know the minute we do it, we'll be accused of every bad thing under the sun. But I think that's the call of our time, is that the church is those who are animated by the biblical religion have to stand athwart all this stuff and just keep shouting the truth about human life, and that the intrinsically evil is a legitimate category. Our lives don't belong to us. They're not about us. They're not in our hands. I'm doing, as you know, this biblical commentary, and there's so much of what can seem arbitrary and peculiar in the Old Testament moral and ritual legislation. But what it's really about is this principle, it seems to me. It's just time and again through ritual action saying to people, your life doesn't belong to you. It belongs to God. It needs to be handed over to God. It came as a gift. It should be celebrated as a gift, and it should be returned as a gift to God on His time, in His way, according to His purposes. But we've gotten so bad. The religions have been so marginalized, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. And the secular narrative, they're evangelists. I mean, they know how to evangelize their perspective. They know how to use the arts. They know how to appeal to young people. So we got to pick up our game, we religious people, and we got to fight this stuff.
A phrase that you've used often before to describe our modern culture is one that's marked by expressive individualism.
Yeah.
Expressive individualism, where I define who I am, I determine the direction of my life, and in this case, I have the right to choose how and when I die. It's up to me. And I think how hard it would be for our culture to stomach everything you just said, where the Christian would come and say in response, well, no, you don't. You don't have the right to determine when your life begins or when your life ends. How do you recommend Christians respond to this expressive individualism in an effective way?
Hold up the saints. So we can talk about it intellectually, as we should, and getting good books and articles and sermons and so on about this is important. But I think, as always, it's the saints. Show lives that didn't belong to these people, it belonged to God, and how God worked through them. Especially saints who achieve their sanctity through suffering. And there are loads of them, because we just had the feast day of St. John of the Cross, one of my great heroes. And the passage we read in the office for his feast day is always, there is no other path to holiness than the path of suffering, path of the cross. And that's not masochism or sadism or something. It's a very deep perception of the Christian life. There is no path to holiness beyond it. So preaching it, but showing the saints, and John of the Cross is a prime example of someone who lived what he taught. I think that's key to it, Brandon.
As we close here, many of us know people, usually in our own family, who have suffered deeply, either during their lives or near the end of their lives. And many of us have recognized those times as opportunities to express love. It's these times that you're cleaning and bathing them, you're driving them around, you're sitting at their bedside, you're offering words of comfort. One other, I think, danger of this euthanasia culture is that it precludes these acts of love. It evacuates the capacity for us to express love to those who are suffering. Instead of helping the suffering person, we eliminate the suffering person.
No, that's a good point, because it's not just about me and how I'm either struggling or benefiting, but we're all in this together. We're all cells and molecules in the mystical body. And so is my suffering, as you suggest, I think quite correctly, an opportunity for someone else to express love. Maybe I'm suffering to draw somebody else out of themselves, to give them an opportunity to show their compassion to me. It's a great mystery. I mean, I don't know in most cases why I'm suffering, but I can trust in God, that God knows why. God has permitted this evil for some greater good, to use that classical formula. But that's a good discipline, that we're not just thinking about ourselves and how it impacts us, but how this suffering impacts others. I think, Brandon, you sent it to me, we're both reading Carl Trueman's book, right, about the formation of the modern self. And he used that, it's evocative, the distinction between mimesis and poiesis, Greek words for imitation and creation, let's say, or making. In classical thought, we imitate the great values that we see on display in great people and saints and so on. And we try to conform our lives to these objective norms. That's the classical view on display up through Nietzsche, let's say, and Sartre and those people. And now it's flipped around, where it's not mimesis, it's poiesis, which means I make myself as a kind of project. Like, I'm going to shape this vase, according to my designs. So my own life, including my own body, is just there for me to make and to shape. That's a kind of sickness, that we've made that weird transition from mimesis to poiesis. That's, I think, a way of naming what's one of the most fundamental problems in the culture.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. Each episode, we play one question for Bishop Barron to answer. If you have something you'd like to ask him, visit the website askbishopbarron.com, and that's where you can record your question. Today, we hear from a young man named Chris in Colorado who's asking about where to go to church on Sundays. Here's his question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Chris from Colorado. My question is it accurate that Protestant church services don't count as fulfilling one's Sunday obligation to go to Mass? And if so, why not? I'm confused why it would matter where exactly we go to worship the Lord, as long as we're doing so.
Well, prayer is always a good thing. And let's say, I've listened to Billy Graham sermons and Charles Stanley sermons that I've benefited from. And so I'm not denying that there can be great grace on offer in these ways. But if you're a Catholic, you've been given a way to worship that God has given us. God's instructed us, here's the way that I want to be worshiped. Not because he's got some psychological hang-up. It's because that's the way that we're going to be drawn most fully into life. And that means the Mass, because the Mass is the representation in sacramental form of the cross of Jesus. And so it's through that great sacrifice that the world is redeemed and that salvation is offered to us. And so that's the right way, because God said so. God has given this to us as the way he wants to be worshiped. And that's why Catholics are obligated to attend Mass. So you can derive benefit from, let's say, Christian sources, as I have, as I say, from preaching and theology and so on. But when it comes to worship, I'm obliged to worship the way God told me to.
Well, all right. Listen, as we wrap up, we are less than 1 month away from Lent. Lent begins on February 22nd. That's Ash Wednesday. And if you're looking for a good book to read during Lent, I have one for you. It just launched today from Word on Fire. It's one we've been excited about for months. It's titled The Power of the Cross, Good Friday Sermons from the Papal Preacher. And it's by Cardinal Raniero Cantalamessa. If you don't know Cardinal Cantalamessa, he has been the papal preacher for the last 40 plus years. This means the only person allowed to preach to the Pope. And in this book, we've collected his homilies from Good Friday over the last 40 years. These homilies that have been preached in the presence of John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis. They're insightful, moving sermons that illuminate the mystery of the Lord's Passion. And it's perfect for Lent because there's 40 homilies. So for the 40 days of Lent, maybe you read one homily each day during Lent. Bishop, I know you're a fan of Cardinal Cantalamessa, who I don't know why this didn't connect with me, is also a Capuchin. Yeah. We've been talking about the Capuchins a lot lately in connection to Shia LaBeouf, but right. I know you've been a big fan of his for a while, haven't you?
I have, yeah. I've been following him for many decades, as you say. He's he must be a man in his mid 80s now, I guess, right? Or high 80s even. And just made a cardinal by Pope Francis, but has been preaching to popes for decades. He also preached to us, the American bishops, a couple years ago. We had that retreat in the wake of the whole McCarrick thing, and we came together. And I think to a person, the bishops found that very powerful. And then those came out as a book, a collection of those sermons. And I think I wrote a blurb for that book. No, I've admired him for a long time. Delighted we're publishing these sermons.
So again, the book's titled The Power of the Cross, Good Friday Sermons from the Papal Preacher, and I'll include a link in the show notes. Well, thanks so much for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.